and it is my review of Press Reset, so the new Jason Schreier book. So I reckon you guys are going to sit back for a second because I got to get through my essay, my video essay. So first off, just a bit of background about this book. So Jason Schreier, formerly writer at Kotaku, now at Bloomberg. I would regard as the best video game writer out there by probably a country mile. Even with that, though,
dude, you got to get a room. You two, it's by this stage. Every episode, you got to think for Jason. I think.
That's correct, Mike. And if you didn't see, I want to go on a bit of a monologue here, as Swinny's gone away as well. Jesus. Yeah. So where was I? I gotta get into my thoughts here. So very much very preeminent writer in the video game industry, but at least from my perspective, and I'm probably like a centrist politically. He's fairly left wing. And, has a lot of political views, very big on unionization, very sort of anti-capitalism in a lot of commentary that he's had in interviews and things like that. And I think it's quite important to set that context because I do think it colors the entire book. And so in terms of the book itself, its central thesis really, delves into this idea of, video games, as a medium can create this amazing interactive art and have insanely, impressive commercial hits, but the studios that create the games don't seem stable. And even where you have examples of very well-supported studios or very extremely well-regarded games and very well-sold games, the actual people that are creating these games have no stability in their lives. And it's a sort of, a dynamic that is very unfair. And it's quite heavy-handed, the book, in the way that it describes it. But really, like, the whole idea of the book is press reset. He closes the book with this is, they need to reset the industry. The way that the dynamics and the norms of the industry, they need to fundamentally change. And I'll go into that later and what I probably think about that as well. In terms of the book itself, I just want to make sure that, like, we capture this. So if anyone's keen on this book, so through the chapters, so there's really 8 chapters. There's one chapter 9, which is, around unions, outsourcing, remote work, an epilogue, which covers Telltale Games, which obviously was written quite recently, the way it was written. And he covers COVID-19 in the unions chapter, which is chapter 9, but that's not really specifically about studios games. So I'll probably park those ones. So chapters 1 through 8. So chapter 1, very much about Warren Spector, Epic Mickey 1 and 2, System Shock, and Deus Ex. So I definitely think you guys would be keen on that one. Chapter 2, Irrational Games, Ken Levine and Bioshock Infinite. Chapter 3, game that I've never heard of, Drake Hollow, and then The Flame and the Flood. So they're ex-Irrational devs, and then the interactions with Google Stadia, which was quite interesting. Chapter 4, 2K Marin and 2K Australia. So that's Bioshock 2 and The Bureau, XCOM Declassified. Chapter 5, Visceral Games, Dead Space Trilogy, and then Ragtag, this Star Wars game, another Star Wars game that got cancelled. And I laugh because Jason Schreier's first book, Blood, Sweat and Pixels, actually talked about 1313, which is another Star Wars game that was cancelled. Chapter 6, which is probably the one that everyone was waiting for, is around Kurt Schilling and Rhode Island and Copernicus, which is the Amela game that never got released in the Amela universe. Chapter 7, Big Huge Games, Kingdoms of Amela, Reckoning, which is actually a game that came out. So we did a review of the remastered version, Re-Reckoning, so you can check that out on our channel. Chapter 8 and the final one around games, Mythic Entertainment, Dungeon Keeper, and then subsequently Enter the Gungeon. So just on the writing, Jason Schreier is an incredible writer, very well written. The book flows really well. It's a bit of a page turner at times. For me, if you're only going to read portions of this book, there is an excerpt around 38 Studios that's really interesting, Kurt Schilling on Bloomberg. Probably my favorite chapter, kind of unfortunately maybe, is chapter 1 around Epic Mickey and Warren Spector. And then probably chapter 2, which is Ken Levine and Bioshock Infinite. So, I guess, in a weird way, unfortunately for me, I was like, oh, wow, this book is incredible. Like, the first 2 chapters were insane. Like, how's this book going to go? And then it did trail off a little bit for me in that way. And And just on that, so the book feels to me a bit claustrophobic, and as a counterpoint, feels very different compared to Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, his first book. With his first book, it was really like, why is it so damn hard to make games? And it was like, that was the thesis of that book, and the exploration, Witcher 3, all these types of games. Whereas with this book, man, this book feels claustrophobic, and it feels like we're just sitting in the same topics, same studio, same people constantly. For me, like I was kind of thinking, this is about a 304-page book. I felt like, man, this guy talks about Warren Spector a lot, right? So I have the Kindle version of this book, and I did a search. How many times does he even mention the word Spectre? 220 times.
Maybe he's talking about Mass Effect.
So it's a 304-page book, and he mentions Spectre 220 times.
Spelled different, Mike. Just
I know.
Bioshock, he mentions Bioshock 176 times. Levine, 96 times. And just to put it in context, he says Sony and Nintendo 11 and 12 times total in the entire book.
Interesting.
So it's just like, I felt that reading it, like going all the way through, random things that he's talking about somehow then becomes about System Shock or Bioshock or Spectre or Levine. And I'm just like, it actually felt like a bit of a weight on the book. Like I'd rather almost just go even deeper on Bioshock Infinite or on Epic Mickey if you're going to stay in that type of zone.
Then you can make a whole book about just that.
Yeah. And just like on the structure of the book, like, does it work? For me, it's a bit of a yes and a bit of a no. So, in general, the structure of it's almost like, look at this great success or this thing that happened, and then look at the fallout. And then if they can, where's the upside? Like, how is it that people have recovered from that position? And to me, it's so heavy-handed, personally, like the way it's structured. It's very... very much like, these studios, these AAA studios are terrible to their people. They work them to the bone. The CEOs get a gazillion dollars, and then all the people are left in the wayside. And then the people who go indie, it's a massive success. And it's just not really the way it works. Like, even for me, just going through some of the journeys of people who have left these studios, not all of them have gone to success, and then not all of them have gone now to AAA. Like the vast majority have stayed in AAA and are probably happy with that and that employment. So like, kind of, does it work? Does it not? For me, it feels very flawed from the start. This idea of like, it just feels like it, the author is just so anti almost capitalism and just has this view around unionization is going to solve all the problems. And I do feel like it's a little bit naive. Like there was even a commentary in the book where it talks about his personal experience with unionization. So as a writer at Kotaku, the whole company became unionized. Now, writing, on a blog, let's say, essentially, and being unionized cannot be anything close to trying to make a piece of art where you're interacting with lots of different people and it's dynamic, and something gets released and it's like released once every 3 to 4 to 5 years. And whether it's a success or not determines if you go on. It's like it just seems so bizarre to me that he's even trying to draw the link and the parallel around his own experience with unionization and something that is so far removed from what his experience with unionization is, to the point where it's like, it's very naive, honestly. Like comparing his experiences in America and then saying, this would apply in China. It's like, no, like it's a totally different context. And that's where like the book to me, like, and ultimately, like, how good is this book? And I'll probably go to like a video game trope to close it out is, let's put it on a tier list. So I'm not saying that Jason Schreier is a bad writer. He's an incredible writer. I think the book is very flawed from my perspective. I think his first book, Blood, Sweat, and Pixels, I'd put in S tier. That's an S tier book. I'd put Masters of Doom, another S tier book. It's all about id Software creating, Quake and all these types of games. Where does this book sit? Because it's a tier list, and you got to be like relative. Like I'd probably give this book like a 3 out of 5, like in a traditional book sense, right? But because it's a tier list is all about being relative. And you got to go, well, what other books are there out there? And because of that, I'd probably still put it in an A tier, because there's just not that many great video game books, unfortunately. And I certainly wouldn't want this book to be a dampener. And this book is selling like gangbusters. It's 3rd on the New York Times bestseller list. like for nonfiction books. Like it's doing really, really well. But to me, it was a big disappointment, honestly. I think out of recent books that have come out, Ask Iwata, sorry, is like much better book, much shorter. It's only like 100 pages long. But yeah, this book is just sort of like, it pulls these threads and it either doesn't go far into the detail enough for me or it follows stories and it's just like, as opposed to the first book where you'd have a whole chapter and a real deep dive on Stardew Valley and the creator behind Stardew Valley. And it's just like really fascinating to live in that sort of world for a period of time. Whereas this always feels a bit broken up, that you're talking about a big game that came out and then, following on for the devs and as they got sacked and everything like that and moved on. So yeah, I'd put it in A tier, but I'd probably put it at the bottom of A tier. And that's kind of where I landed on this book.
But do you recommend people read it?
So this is an interesting question. I think for people like us, 100%, because there's like lots of insights and just how people think and studios, everything like that. I think if you're a general punter, honestly, I'd skip this book and read Blood, Sweat and Pixels. If you've read that book and like Masters of Doom and you're super hungry to read books about video games, then yeah, read it. But I don't think this is a compelling book on its own. Whereas Blood, Sweat and Pixels and Masters of Doom, I'd just give it to anyone. I'd go, just read this if you're fascinated about stuff. It's interesting. It's captivating. I don't think this book's captivating. I feel like it does rely on, us knowing a lot of these things. And I feel like just a general punter would be like, who the hell is this bloody Warren Spector guy that he's talking about 220 times?
But that's what I was about to say. Like Warren Spector, Ken Levine, these are very well-known figures in the industry.
Yeah.
If you're fans of those people and their work, is it worth reading?
Oh, 100%. I think if you're fascinated about, BioShock or, Warren Spector or what's going on with, System Shock 3, like he covers that in this book a few times, actually.
I'm more interested in, so I don't know, when I look at topics like this that are pretty big topics to talk about, if you're talking about, a particular toxic thing about an industry, you need a huge sample size as opposed to, from what I'm hearing from you, and I don't know because I haven't read the book, what seems to be a relatively small sample size of companies and people that have gone through that process. Am I understanding that correctly?
You can't spread yourself too thin, though.
You can't spread yourself too thin, but it's like if you're talking about a topic like this that's supposed to be this huge issue with the industry, I think you need more than 3 or 4 examples, big examples of a thing. Companies go under all the time. I've worked for projects that I've put in a year's worth of effort or even a couple of years worth of effort that have gone absolutely nowhere. I got absolutely no reward at the end of it, nothing, not even like a thank you for wasting 2 years of your existence doing this shit. It happens in so many different industries that, picking 3 examples, you need way more than that to say it's a huge systemic issue that needs to be completely addressed. And I'm not saying it isn't a huge systemic issue because it probably is. I don't work in the industry, so I can't comment on that, but I work in other industries where exactly the same issues happen.
Of course. But
I would say if I'm going to, present my case forward, I would give a shit ton of examples as to why it's happening, as opposed to picking a small handful. And I get that, you don't want to spread yourself too thin. It's a book, etc. But it's a topic that I think needs a lot of backing to discuss broadly in the industry, not just a few samples within that. But again, I haven't read it. I'm just going through what you're saying. So
yeah,
but
I mean, look, like there's a couple of things that I'll pick up on there for what you're saying, Mike. So yeah, I totally agree. I think when you start going down anecdotal routes to argue system problems, like that's so dangerous because you got to look at these things at a very macro level. You can always pick out anecdotes either side to say why it's great, which it's not, and why it's terrible, which it's not. It's mixed. It's mixed results, right? There's plenty of examples of studios that treat their people well, plenty of examples that they don't treat their people well. And I think, for me, I think that's just where the book fails as an idea, for me personally, that instead of, living a little bit less politically from a, central thesis perspective and just, trying to bring out a balanced view, it does feel very much like trying to support its argument that the industry is broken in at least the States. And again, it's a very Western view, right? Like I found it fascinating that, you know, he never touches on, you know, any Japanese studios, you know, where they actually do have the same people. You can go on like Moby Games, which is like the IMDb for video games, and you'll see like people stay at studios for long periods of time in Japan. And he never explores like, why is it different in Japan versus America? Or why is America very similar to European companies? And there's a lot of unionization in European countries. So why is it not happening there? And it just, like I said, it at times, and I really dislike that about like Schreier's reporting, that, you know, it does very much sometimes, and people are going to get offended at what I'm about to say, but it feels very like university political discussion where it's just so naive, so detached from the real world. You know, people are like, oh, communism's the greatest. And then you go, well, okay, show me an example of where it worked. It's been in many countries, right? And people can't point to one, right? And then they criticize capitalism whilst wearing Nike shoes. Like it feels very naive at times. And it's a shame because this guy, and, you know, Mike saying like, I'm the #1 fan club. You know, I think his writing's amazing and his insights and his ability to, you know, get stories on the record from people is just incredible. Like some of the stuff in the book, like it's fascinating because it's, you know, we're talking about a year ago, some of the stories, you know, when they're talking about Google Stadia and kind of the execs, whilst being really nice people, just having no idea about games. I mean, that's probably no shock of a revelation. Whereas Microsoft, you know, was really great to deal with as according to the folks behind Drake's Hollow. But yeah, like I said, I just wish that he didn't go into that political side as much, because I feel like it would have just been such a better book. And I think he would have allowed more space for the reader to make their own mind up. Whereas it just feels like so heavy-handed at times of like AAA bad, you know, CEO bad. Why is he getting that much money? You know, why aren't the workers getting paid millions of dollars? Or why aren't the workers in charge of their schedules? And yet in his own book, he talks about studios that basically can do whatever they want and they can't make games. So it's kind of like, he just feels like he argues against himself unbeknownst to himself at times. It's just, I don't know. And you can even see with the writing at times, he even calls it out. Like, oh, it's almost like, well, you know, I've said this, but, you know, this is reason why it's not true. And I'm like, not sure if that really rings true to me, but parking all that, you know, yes, if you're interested in BioShock, you know, the Kurt Schilling story, Irrational Games, Mythic, some of these huge studios, Visceral Games, like the Dead Space trilogy, you'll get a lot out of the book. You just
I actually
have to wade through the politics. I'd be really interested to hear what you guys think about it.
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna definitely pick it up.
So yeah, that's my review of Press Reset. I've been looking forward to this book for a long, long time. But I actually cancelled my physical order of it. I got a Kindle version of it and I was going to get the physical still, but I actually cancelled it because I don't think I'll ever reread it again. Whereas Blood, Sweat and Pixels, I'll definitely reread that book. That was a really cool book. All right, for our final segment,